Well, Joe Hockey's thoughts on housing affordability are still generating debate over property prices. The Treasurer's pleading for people to play the policy, not the man. There's not much hope of that. Bill Shorten's accusing Mr Hockey of being completely out of touch. Still, the question remains, what's a good job and what's affordable in hot real estate markets? They're questions that have changed the government's rhythm today, and the Prime Minister's been watching the bewildering ups and downs in the housing debate since daybreak.
Put a warm up, okay? Otherwise, any sorts of things happen.
She sits on her ass, he works his hands through the bone to give her money every payday.
The starting point for a first home buyer is to get a good job that pays good money.
I won't pay ya, no way. Now, why don't you get a job?
Let's not play the man, let's actually deal with the policy here.
Now, why don't you get a job?
Every time Joe Hockey opens his mouth, we get an explanation of how out of touch the whole government is.
What you've got to do is make sure that as a government you work towards creating more jobs with greater income.
I guess all this money, well, it isn't enough to keep a bill collectors at bay.
Look, if housing were unaffordable in Sydney, no one would be buying it.
Well, I guess it ain't easy doing nothing at all. Oh, yeah.
For a lot of people, a lot of Australians in Sydney and Melbourne, some other parts of Australia, housing is very hard, very expensive, and I understand that. I totally understand that.
I won't pay ya, no way.
We want people to have rising house values.
Joe Hockey's comments were a brain snap.
Yes, it is difficult for first home buyers to get into the market. There's no doubt about that.
Now, why don't you get a job?
All of what Joe Hockey has just said in terms of how you can gain access to housing finance is true.
Joe Hockey's comments were a brain snap.
It's a challenge. Living in an expensive city, particularly like Sydney, is a real challenge for people.
Say no way, yeah, no way.
The response has to be to build, build, build.
You get a job.
Getting a bounce in the polls, Prime Minister.
So Joe Hockey's advice on getting a good and well-paying job and on housing affordability were based on economic theory, and they do reflect a number of government policies in that area. But Bill Shorten's been out today calling on Tony Abbott to justify what his Treasurer had to say.
What Tony Abbott has to do today is show some leadership. Either he's, tied at the waist, tied at the hip to Joe Hockey, and he agrees with Joe Hockey's out-of-touch comments, or Tony Abbott will actually correct and rebuke his Treasurer, show some leadership and show that Tony Abbott understands what's really happening for a lot of Australian families.
I'm just not going to get into running a commentary on things. I'm just going to stress the fact that Joe has done the best possible thing by the home buyers of Australia through bringing down a budget that will be good for jobs, that will be good for business, that will be good for confidence, because that's what we want. We want a strong economy with strong jobs growth, where people can have a go and get ahead. That's what we want, a strong economy where people can have a go and get ahead. And Joe has certainly been talking at length today about all the things that we are doing to help the home buyers of our country.
Well, the Social Services Minister, Scott Morrison, thinks Joe Hockey's analysis of housing markets was pretty close to the mark. He's in Melbourne today, where we spoke to him about housing stress and childcare. Well, Scott Morrison, you're there talking childcare. Can we check in on progress with negotiations of that package? It's always been linked in funding terms to cuts to family tax benefit B. Have you told any senator in negotiations that you would be prepared to decouple those two issues?
Well, the details of these discussions are between myself and the senators, and I don't intend to provide a running commentary on those discussions. We're working constructively together. They're raising issues, we're responding, and that's the way this process works.
I think Senator Leyonhjelm has expressed publicly a view that you would be prepared to do that. If that were true, that's a marked departure from the position that you've adopted since budget night.
Well, no, the government is quite clear about our view that if you want to increase investment in this area, then that has to be paid for by savings. And we've identified what those savings are, and they're the savings that we're committed to achieving. We're in discussions about the precise nature of a number of these measures with the crossbench, and I'm finding those discussions are very positive, very good-natured, and there's a lot of good faith. And Senator Leyonhjelm has been a leader in that area in terms of engaging with us on those matters. But as far as you're concerned,
it still sticks around family tax benefit B, though. That remains the funding item that pays for it.
Well, there are four measures. There's not just one measure here, there are four. There is the FTB payment freeze, so not a reduction in payments, but a freeze in payments. There is the threshold freeze, there's the reduction in the family tax benefit supplement, and there is what is known from the previous budget as the under sixes measure. Now, all of those measures are being discussed with the crossbench, and we are engaged in active listening when it comes to these things, and that's exactly what we're doing. And so there's a raft of measures there, and we've had some feedback, particularly on one of those measures, the under sixes measure, and we're continuing to pursue those issues.
Well, as someone who oversees the budget for rental assistance through Centrelink, do you share the government's view that ever-rising property prices, and they flow through to rent, obviously, are a good thing?
Well, property values are the basis of what many small businesses actually mortgage to drive their businesses. I mean, the way that and the role that property plays in our economy has always been fairly central, not just to ours, but many other economies. But when it comes to housing affordability, and that's not just owning your own home, but renting the home you're living in, I mean, these are the issues that put pressure on families' budgets. The percentage of disposable income that is being spent on rent is on average just over 25%, but for those who are owning their own home, buying their own home through a mortgage, it's just over 31%.
That's getting close to a danger zone, though, isn't it? That's a pressure point there.
Well, the 30% is I'm advised by the sector, is an area where the stress really starts to kick in, and that is of concern, obviously, and that's why we have policies and a focus to ensure that we're trying to alleviate the pressure. So,
as a Sydney-sider, what's your assessment of the market, particularly for those wanting to get into it? Affordable or unaffordable right now, given the 31% that you've cited already?
Well, it's always been difficult to get into the Sydney housing market. I remember when Jan and I bought our first small, tiny unit in Sydney. It was difficult then, and that was 20 years ago. It's difficult today, and it requires often the support of family and others, and making various decisions and sacrifices, and it's always tough. But the question is why are the prices moving the way they are? And the fundamental reason for that, as the Treasurer has identified, is the lack of supply and the mismatch of supply and demand in the housing market, particularly in Sydney, to a lesser extent here in Melbourne. But the average price growth across the rest of the country has been about 2.5%, and in Perth and Darwin we've actually seen much lower than that, in fact negative results. So housing markets can be cyclical, but it's always been tough to get into the Sydney housing market, and what we have to do as a government is what we are doing, work with the states to free up supply.
And in political terms, do you think the Treasurer's comments and the attention they've received passed the sensitivity test with punters?
Others are making commentary on those issues. I think, as is often the case in these situations, I think the commentary has failed to appreciate the depth of concern that the Treasurer has on these issues. I know that to be the case because Joe and I have talked about these issues for many years in opposition and in government. I mean, at one time, early on, I was the Shadow Minister for Housing and he was the Shadow Treasurer, and we would engage on these issues then. I know the Treasurer has a deep and abiding concern about ensuring that families across the country get access to good housing, affordable housing, and above all, they have the opportunity wherever they can to buy and own their own home. That is part of the great Australian dream for all families, and we want to continue to ensure that as many families as possible can achieve that. And that's about supporting their choices. It's about allowing small business to grow. It's about enabling families to be able to go back to work where they want to do that.
Australia's ambassador to Indonesia, Paul Gregson, is familiarising himself with his Jakarta office again this week after returning to work there. He was withdrawn in protest over the executions of Andrew Chan and Morrison Sukumaran a little over 5 weeks ago. Now the Foreign Minister has judged that the time is right to try to restore the relationship to normality.
The recalling of our ambassador from Indonesia was unprecedented, and it certainly marked our displeasure with the Indonesian government's decision to proceed with the execution of Mr Chan and Mr Sukumaran. But we believe it's time for our ambassador to go back to Indonesia to carry out his very important work there, which includes consular support for other Australians in Indonesia, also our work on counter-terrorism, on transnational crime, on people smuggling, as well as the common interests that we have with Indonesia on greater trade and investment, on greater tourism and student exchange. So he has a lot of work to do, and it was time for him to return to Indonesia.
And will ministerial meetings also resume?
They have not yet been resumed.
Any idea when that will happen?
We are considering that option now. It's under review, but at this stage we felt it was time for our ambassador to resume his duties in Indonesia. We have made our point. The Indonesian government is under no illusion as to how the Australian government felt about the execution of 2 Australians who had been rehabilitated, but the question of ministerial visits is still under review.
Well, Bill Farmer is a former Australian ambassador to Indonesia. Before the executions, he warned against recalling its top diplomat from Jakarta in retaliation, but it went ahead and did it anyway. We spoke to him a short time ago about where the relationship goes from here. Well, Bill Farmer, Ambassador Paul Gregson has returned to Jakarta after five plus weeks of absence. Does that strike you initially as quite a short period for the withdrawal of an ambassador in this case?
I think it's very good that he's gone back, and frankly I wouldn't be talking too much about whether it's too short, too long. I think really that's a non-issue. The issue is that he's gone back to do the job for which he's being paid and which he's doing very well.
And so the point was made in the initial withdrawal, I suppose, and what's your interpretation beyond that? It doesn't really matter about duration and you know, any ruffled feathers there may have been in Indonesia?
Look, I think it's all about us, the decision to withdraw the ambassador. And, you know, we've withdrawn him for consultations. He's had his consultations. He's going back. And then I think on both sides what we're seeing is Julie Bishop saying, yes, we're now going to begin the process of developing our relations in the way we've been doing for a long time. We're seeing the Indonesians also reacting in a very low-key way. We're ready to start rebuilding.
And what's the significance when an ambassador goes back in? What is likely to flow from that? Will we see ministerial contact, which has been suspended? Will we see that restored soon?
Look, I think what we should see is a gradual resumption of getting on with each other. There's a lot going on in Jakarta between Australia and Indonesia. We need to pursue that with seriousness of purpose. I don't myself think it's a very good sign when a country like Australia rushes in after being in the Indonesians' face for quite a while and starts inundating them with senior level visits. And I don't think we'll see that. I think what we should do is, in a measured way, do what we've actually been doing very well with Indonesia over a long time, and that is work with them, so that we can re-establish high-level contacts and basically work to pursue Australian interests.
Will that be hard, do you think, to re-establish those high-level contacts? Is there residual damage in Jakarta?
Look, I think it's a bit hard to read President Jokowi's views on international affairs. He's not like his predecessor, President Yudhoyono. He doesn't really have what you'd call a strong international bent. And his efforts so far seem to have focused on trade and investment, and that's understandable given his economic and business background. So he's not, I would say, a natural internationalist.
Well, that's it from us here on Capitol Hill today. There's more news coming in an update in just a few moments, and we'll be back tomorrow.